nipo katika banda moja hapa na hivyo tutaenda kujionea na kuzungumza nao mawili matatu juu ya nini hasa kilichowasukuma hadi wao kuweza kufika hapa katika siku hii ya leo, lakini imekuwaje mpaka wamekuja na bidhaa zao na mambo mengi na kadha wa kadha kuhusiana na wao. Karibu. Nipo katika banda la Repoa na karibu. Habari yako baba? Unaitwa nani? Amani sana, naomba utuelezee zaidi kuhusiana na Repoa. Nimeona hapa kuna huduma mbalimbali, lakini naomba uzielezee wewe mwenyewe kwa undani zaidi.
Sisi Repoa ni taasisi ya utafiti ambayo inashughulikia mambo ya utafiti katika maeneo mbalimbali kwa ajili ya maendeleo ya jamii kutokana na maisha ya ubora kwa kila
katika meza yako. Naona hapa umenielezea hivyo vizuri sana, lakini katika meza yako naona kuna vipeperushi vingi vinavyoelezea huduma zenu, lakini kuna Mtanzania inawezekana anafuatilia sasa hivi na anatamani kujua zaidi ni huduma gani hasa zinazopatikana kwa jamii. Mtu anawapata vizuri.
Tunafanya kwa namna mbili. Kuna zile tafiti zingine ambazo tunazidesign sisi wenyewe ambazo tunaita strategic research. Alafu kuna zingine tunafanya collaboration. Kwa hiyo taasisi ambayo itakuwa inaendelea kufanya utafiti katika eneo fulani inaweza kushirikiana na sisi kufanya utafiti kutokana na hicho ambacho tunategemea kufanya.
Asante sana. Mojawapo kati ya malengo ya kigoda cha kiprofesa cha Mwalimu Julius Nyerere cha taaluma za Umoja wa Afrika ni kusupport tafiti mbalimbali zinazoweza kuleta na kuchangia maendeleo ya Tanzania na Afrika kwa ujumla. Na nipo katika meza ya pili hapa. Kaka, habari yako?
Salama. Mimi naitwa Osman Salim, ni mfanyakazi wa Kuki na Nyota Publishers, sales marketing.
Nyinyi Kuki na Nyota tunaona kuna vitabu vingi katika meza yenu. Je, kuna huduma gani zingine mbali na za vitabu ambavyo mna publish ambazo zinapatikana katika Kuki na Nyota?
Huduma ambazo zinapatikana katika kampuni yetu ni publishing service ambazo tunakaribisha watu kuja kwetu kupublish vitabu endapo kutokana na masuala yao utakaoleta. Tutaangalia je, kama kitabu kina tija basi tutapata pamoja, kama kina tija basi kuna njia tutakupa ambazo wewe na sisi kati yetu zote zina faida. Na pia kuna vitabu mbalimbali vya waheshimiwa, tunapublish vitabu vya story, na sasa hivi wakati huu tunakuwa nao ni wakati wa Kiswahili ambapo tunasema Kiswahili kipo juu. Kiswahili kipo juu, sasa hivi tumejikita sana kwenye vitabu vya Kiswahili. Kwa mfano tuna riwaya mpya. Kwa mfano hii ni Wila Wasichana. Hii ni riwaya mpya ambayo imeshika tuzo la Safari kwa leo, ambayo ni watu wamezoea na mabati. Kwa hiyo kwa kweli tuna vitabu vingi ambavyo vingi nikielezea sitaweza kumaliza. Karibu sana.
Asante. Na inawezekana kuna mtu anatazama na ni mwandishi wa vitabu vya Kiswahili na ameona namna gani mnaweza mkaunga mkono kazi zake. Je, anatakiwa afanye nini hadi
kufikia afike kwetu? Tuko Samara na Webu, na pia anaweza kutembelea tovuti yetu www.mkupinanyota.com. Endapo akisha tufikia huko atauliza
ipo kama vitabu vile kwa njia ya mtandao audio na kadhalika?
Hapana, hatuna hiyo kwa sababu bado tuko kwenye uchunguzi wa kuona huduma hiyo kama kwetu italeta tija.
Nashukuru sana. Na kukumbusha tu kwamba kigoda cha kiprofesa cha Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere cha taaluma za umajumui wa Afrika kilianzishwa tangu mwaka 2008 na mwenyekiti kwa wakati huu, mwenyekiti wa kwanza kabisa alikuwa ni Profesa Isa Shivji, na sasa hivi kigoda kina takriban miaka 14. Ipo katika meza nyingine, naona ina vitabu vimesheheni kweli kweli, na kutana na mlango hapa. Habari yako dada? Unaitwa nani? Naomba nieleze sana kuhusiana na meza yako, mnatumia gani na mnafanyaje?
Sisi
mnauza vitabu. Watu wanapataje vitabu hivyo na utaratibu hadi kuuza hivyo vitabu? Sawa, nikiangalia kwenye meza yako naona imesheheni vitabu vingi sana vya Kiingereza na alafu vichache ndio vya Kiswahili. Je, kwa tathmini yako fupi unaweza kusema ni vitabu gani hasa vina wasomaji wengi, vya Kiswahili au vya Kiingereza? Wasomaji wa vitabu vya Kiingereza ni watu wa aina gani? Na vitabu vya Kiswahili? Kwa hiyo haujakutana na changamoto yoyote, yaani nyinyi mkutana na changamoto yote ya utofauti uliokuwepo katika lugha ya vitabu hivi? Wote ni sawa sawa? Sawa, inasema kuna mtu anahitaji kupata vitabu vyenu, unapatikana tu, lazima apate hard copy au hadi aje afike physically, au mnauza pia online? Njia online? Sawa, asante sana, nashukuru sana. Mojawapo kati ya waasisi wa jumuiya ya umajumui wa Afrika wapo wengi sana, ikiwemo Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, lakini pia kuna Walter Rodney, kuna Robert Mugabe na watu wengine mashujaa wa Afrika kadha wa kadha. Nipo katika meza nyingine na kutana na watu wanaohusika na meza hii na tuweze kupata taarifa kidogo kutoka kwao. Habari yako?
Salama tu.
Unaitwa nani? Sawa, Catherine, naona meza yako hapa ina vitabu mbalimbali, vitabu viko vingi kabisa katika meza yako. Naomba unielezee zaidi kuhusiana na meza hii.
Sasa kutoka machapisho mbalimbali ya Tanzania. Tunachapa ile almanac, tunachapa ile kalenda kama unavyoona, kuna prospectus pia na vitu mbalimbali. Na hapa vingi wanakuwa wameandika walimu hapa chuo kikuu. Na vichache wameandika watu wa nje ya nchi.
Na wanafunzi je, ambao ni waandishi mnahusika na hivi? Utaratibu ukoje katika kupokea kazi za wanafunzi? Mwanafunzi tu anaweza akawa na kazi yake au yoyote akaileta na ikachapishwa au
Tulicha kazi yake ikishafika pale kuna wataalamu pale. Kuna maedita, kuna graphic designer, kuna typesetter, kwa kadhalika ikifika pale cha kwanza watu wanaangalia je kazi ina ubora. Takusio kila kazi ambayo tunachapa tunaangalia na ile kazi ina ubora ndio tunaifanyia kazi. Kama ina ubora tunarudia kama kazi hapana.
Kwa hiyo wanafunzi wa level zote kuanzia undergraduate na postgraduate wote wanaruhusiwa kupata kazi zao?
Ni watu wote kwa jumla. Kinachokita kwa wanafunzi wote kwa jumla.
Vigezo hivyo ni vipi kama hautojali ili mtazamaji aweze kujua endapo na yeye ana kazi yake anatamani sana, na naona hapa katika meza yako kuna vitabu vingi sana na vingine vikielezea uzalendo, kujitoa na kujituma, historia na mambo mengi sana. Je, naona pia kuna vitabu vya lugha mbili. Wasomaji wa vitabu vya Kiingereza ni wengi?
Ni wengi sana.
Na waletaji wa hizi kazi pia ni wengi? Na kwa Kiswahili?
Kiswahili ni chache
Hawa wanaoleta kazi za Kiingereza wengi ni Watanzania hapa ambao ni wanafunzi au ni watu wote ambao wataingia chuo? Wote ni watu ambao wamekulia hapa ni Watanzania?
Wengi ni walimu na watu ambao wanawaita.
Sawa, mnapatikana katika mitandao ya kijamii na kadhalika? Mnapatikanaje? Sawa. Kwa mnapatikana Instagram na kwenye mitandao mingine. Asante sana. Wakati tupo katika mapumziko mafupi ya kuelekea kuendelea na kigoda cha kiprofesa cha Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, napenda kukukumbusha tena kwamba kigoda hichi kilianzishwa mwaka 2008 mwezi wa 4 kwa ajili ya kuweza kukua kama sehemu ya kuweza kuelezea na kutambua jitihada mbalimbali za viongozi wa umajumui wa Afrika. Na mpaka sasa ni takriban miaka 14 tangu kuanzishwa kwake, na sasa hivi nipo katika meza nyingine kabisa, nipo katika meza ya Tanzania National Park. Dada, habari yako? Unaitwa nani? Asante sana. Naona hii ni meza ya TANAPA. Naomba tuelezee zaidi kuhusiana na huduma zenu.
Huduma ni nzuri, lakini tuko hapa kwa ajili ya kuhamasisha utalii wa ndani. Kwa hiyo tunapotoka sasa hivi tunapoelekea kwenye dijitali, hii skana ambayo mtu akiskani anaweza kupata taarifa zote za hifadhi za taifa. Lakini kikubwa zaidi, tuko hapa kumzungumzia Mwalimu Nyerere kama tunavyojua kigoda leo kuhusu Mwalimu Nyerere. Tuko hapa kuzungumzia mapokezi ya Mwalimu Nyerere. Hii nyumba inapatikana Magomeni Usalama, na hii nyumba iko kwa ajili ya harakati za uhuru wa Kenya alotoa Mwalimu Nyerere wakati wa kupigania uhuru. Na utakapofika katika nyumba hii utaweza kuona maisha ya Nyerere wakati wa kupigania uhuru, ni maisha gani alishirikiana na kina nani, utaweza kuona pale. Kwa hiyo maisha ya Nyerere kabla ya uhuru yote yanapatikana pale kabisa.
Magomeni sehemu gani?
Magomeni Usalama ni nyuma tu ya jengo la Julius House. Na kuna video ni rahisi sana hasa kwa Watanzania, ambapo ni 2360 kwa mtu mzima, lakini kwa mwanafunzi au mtoto ni 1180.
2360.
2360. Tunaishi ni 2360 ni ongezeko la thamani.
Kwa hakika gharama ni nafuu sana na inaweza kufika na kila Mtanzania, na kwa mtoto ni shilingi 1000 tu. Kwa hiyo kwa watoto ni wanafunzi wa kuanzia primary hadi sekondari.
Hadi miaka 15. 1180.
1180 tu. Asante sana dada, kwa hakika Mtanzania hawezi kukosa nafasi ya kuja kutembelea nyumba hiyo. Ili kuna lingine la kutuongezea?
Nilikuwa naongezea kwamba tu wazalendo, tumwenzi Nyerere kwa vitendo. Tusimwenzi tu kwa kuongea, kusema Nyerere tutafikia uhuru, tuje tuone maisha aliyoishi. Nyerere alifanya yapi hadi tunaweza kukumbuka kutoka kwa wakoloni. Kwa hiyo wakaribisha sana Watanzania kuja kujifunza historia katika nyumba.
Asante sana. Hichi ni kigoda cha Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere kinachofanyika leo hapa katika chuo kikuu cha Dar es Salaam. Kuna meza mbalimbali zenye huduma mbalimbali, na ni muhimu sana kwako wewe, kama alivyokwisha kusema dada, kwamba ni muhimu sana kumweza kumwenzi Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, si tu kwa maneno bali pia kwa vitendo. Tunapokuwa tukiongelea kwamba kigoda cha kiprofesa cha Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere cha taaluma za umajumui wa Afrika, tunamaanisha ni mimi na wewe, kila Mtanzania ana nafasi ya kumwenzi baba wa taifa, na kazi hiyo inaanzia kwetu sisi ili kuweza kupata maendeleo ya Afrika kwa ujumla, maendeleo ya Tanzania, lakini lengo kuu likiwa ni maendeleo
Demonstrating African countries' commitment to promoting security. And also we can trace the departure of the OAU's ideal from promoting sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as the non-intervention in the state's affairs through the establishment of peace and security architecture is mandated to intervene whenever there is gross violation of human rights as well as internal conflicts. There are so many other aspects that we can reflect on, but this afternoon we have 3 panelists, 1 keynote speaker, and 2 presenters. And I would wish to introduce our session's keynote speaker, Professor Wanyama Masinde, who is seated at the center, who is Professor of Regional Integration and Public Policy Director at the Center for Regional Integration. Professor Masinde will give a presentation on African state sovereignty at bay, religion, insurgency, and foreign intervention. He will spend about 30 minutes to talk about this important topic. The first speaker, who is far to my left and left to our keynote speaker, Dr. Rasul Minja. He's a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. He will spend about 10, 15, 20 minutes at most to talk about regional security arrangements. Are they toothless paper tigers or empowering instruments of African states? The second presenter, Dr. Ali Masabo, who is just seated closer to my left hand. He's representing Mr. Omari Mjenga, as indicated in the program. He'll talk about insurgency threats to national and regional security, the case of Mozambique. Dr. Masabo is a lecturer at the Center for Foreign Relations and Director for Capacity Building at the Center for International Policy. I wish to take this opportunity to invite Professor to the podium to give his keynote speech. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Professor Mkandala, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for hosting this event. Senior colleagues, students, guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really happy to be here. I'm always happy to be in Dar es Salaam. Many times I come here, I find time to engage with elders who have so much experience and whom we have so much to learn from, and they always inculcate the ideals of Pan-Africanism in we, the younger generation. Of course, the students are not that young, but it's always a good place to engage in intellectual discourse. And it's good also to be here. I have had students coming over for their postgraduate studies, and I also have students who are here, for example, at the TGCL, so it's always good to be here. My work focuses quite a bit on regional integration, global governance, and public policy, so it might be a bit of a shift from what you had before. And it's always not the best thing to speak without having listened to the previous speakers. So I hope I don't repeat what they said, or I don't contradict them, or otherwise I may look not so smart by repeating what they said. But thank you very much. So I will look at this issue, African state sovereignty at bay, religion, insurgency, and foreign intervention, by just taking us through a short glimpse of sovereignty before going on to look at the changing circumstances across the globe and where Africa is not cut out. Africa is part and parcel of that. and then look at insurgency and how it impacts the continent's state sovereignty, then go on to religion and its influences, and come back to look at what all this means for us. And it's good that colleague speakers are going to be looking at the security architecture and how and the security arrangements on the continent, how relevant and they are, how effective they are, and also looking at insurgency and the challenges that the Cabo Delgado region of Mozambique and the wider region is facing. So this topic is huge, it's huge. 30 minutes, not effort to go through it. So what is, where are we? Where are we? If we will look around trying to understand sovereignty, which forms the bedrock of international relations, and which talks about a state's authority and control over its own territory, and looking at how this has played out over time on the continent and the challenges that African states have to grapple with as they safeguard this sovereignty, because we fought for independence, our bearers fought for independence, and they still feel the need to safeguard this independence. But there are changing circumstances that affect this sovereignty, which is a fundamental principle of international relations, as I've said, and which is the more important for Africa, having come out of colonialism not too long ago. And I remember, for example, when we were negotiating, when South Sudan was negotiating entry to the EAC, one of the issues they raised is that we fought a bloody war of independence. We just came out of that recently. We gained independence just recently. Why do you want us to go to the EAC and give up some of what we just recently fought for? And so when we think about sovereignty, all these things run through our mind. But we live now in a globalizing world where there's a lot of interconnectedness, there are lots of exchanges. What Professor Arjuna Pajurai characterizes as scapes, and he talks about 5 scapes, that we have ethnoscapes, which represent movement of people across the world, technology through technoscapes, technologies influencing all of us, rapid movement of finance in its financescapes across borders, media influences, mediascapes, that the media is continuously influencing us all across the globe, and ideoscapes, the movement of ideas, and therein lies democracy as well. But there's a lot of interchange, exchange, and that we are connected in many ways. We are communities of faith, such that those of us seated here may be connected to those in the US, to those in Europe, or to those in South Africa. But there's this movement, this change. And the citizenry our countries had at independence is all the citizenry we have now. But we have been influenced by all these things, and there's a lot of change going on. There's a lot of change going on. And so this has necessarily impacted on the state. State sovereignty is being influenced in many, many ways. And looking at our states also, Africa, we fought for independence, we were promised economic transformation, fight against illiteracy, poverty, and disease. But there are challenges that our states still have to fight with. They have to look for resources to be able to take us out of these challenges. And in the search for resources, they have to engage with other players outside of the states also, the international financial institutions, multinational corporations, civil society organizations, which are also advanced by the many ideas moving across the globe. And so the state is not the only player in the global environment. There are other influences, there are other challenges. And when we hear about Mozambique, we're going to see that the other players are coming and threatening the state, that the state's enemy, the state's challenge is not just other states, but other players as well. And so when we look back and to the end of the Cold War and the changes that have taken place since, we see lots of global transformations going on, and the state has to transform itself to be able to survive these. And the new players, I say, the new players on the continent as well. The state faces many challenges. The continent has experienced war, has experienced all forms of conflict. And the state has to manage these conflicts. And at present, if you look at the continent, Africa is experiencing many challenges. Looking at the Africa Integration Report, which is used for the media summit, the one that was used at the summit last year in June in Lusaka, there's a map there that shows hotspots, conflict spots on the continent where there's instability, and we see these dotted across from the north of the continent through the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, Central Africa, down to Mozambique in the south, and you see that these are challenges that states have to grapple with, threatening the state. And the problem is that some of these challenges don't just face one state, they face multiple states. And then we have challenges of COVID coming in and impacting economies and making the state even more vulnerable. So if we look at Africa since independence, we have had lots of different types of conflicts. Tiambe Zeleza groups these conflicts into 6, and I'll add a 7th one. And he characterizes the conflicts that have taken place on the continent as secessionist wars, irredentist wars, irredentist where people on one part of the one side of the border want to join up with their core ethnics on the other side of the border. We have had coups and wars seeking a change of regime. We've had wars of social banditry where we have warlords seeking to exploit mineral resources and other resources from the regions that they control. We have had also intercommunal or communal insurrections. We've had people rebelling against the state. And then we have other forms of armed conflict. But beyond these, we have what we call the new wars, wars that were not there. And the new wars involve terrorism and extremist violence that are endangering the state. Violent extremism, terrorism, the big debate of the moment, looking at what is happening in the Sahel, what's happening in the Horn of Africa. In recent weeks, we have seen what happened in Uganda, in Somalia. And these challenges are challenges that the state has to deal with. And the question then, all along this journey looking at the challenges is the state building capacity to respond to the old wars, the old conflicts that were there, as well as these new ones that threaten its sovereignty? Does the state have the capacity? Is the state transforming? Is the state working with other states to be able to address this? Because on its own, the state cannot be able to address these challenges. And so these are issues that we continue to face. And How does insurgency affect sovereignty? We know that there's a fight for territorial control, there's the fight for control of state institutions. We see state institutions being eroded. We see exploitation of resources, which I've already mentioned. And so the continent faces these challenges. And the question that we're going to look at later is how the continent is responding to these. And I could go deeper into the 7 different forms of conflict that have taken place, but I won't do that just yet, because we are already we're going to have this addressed by one of the panelists. So and later, as we move towards intervention, we see how is the state responding to be able to address this. We'll also see the search for external support, the intervention that comes in, some outside of the states on requests that some the state has requested, and some other support has nearly been imposed on the state. And one question that comes to mind is, where does the state go to for help? And is the state going for help? Yes, the state is going for help. And we'll see that when we come to intervention. But let's go back to the Organization of African Unity being formed in 1963. States were fighting for independence. Those that were newly independence from the colonial powers, because independence is not just gaining territory, but independence, economic independence, independence politically, and we see those that are yet to gain independence fighting for independence as well. And at that time, the inviolability of territory is very important. All states are looking to protect their territory. And the question then later is, how do you survive on your own? The OAU operates 1999 in Sirt. The AU summit in Sirt comes to the conclusion that the OAU first was to fight for independence. We have attained this independence. In 1980, we have the Lagos Plan of Action, looking at to transform our economies. And yet, in 1999, the economies are not doing well. What do we need to do? In 1991, we see the Abuja Treaty that came into force in 1994. Africa says, no, we must do lots more. At the Lagos Plan of Action, Africa said, let's diversify our economies. In 1991, Africa in Abuja realizes that we can't go it alone, we have to work with one another. In 1999, the heads of state say, no, this is not working. So in Sirt, they say, no, the OAU is not fit for purpose. Let's transform it into the African Union. And from Sirt, they go to Togo, later in Lusaka, and the African Union is launched in Durban. And a key issue is that we have seen what has happened on the continent. In 1994, there was a genocide in Rwanda. Africa at that time was talking about non-interference. But Africa realizes that now we have to stop indifference and take action when action is required. Are we going to wait for people from outside to come and address our problems? We also have new leaders on the continent at that time. Of course, there was President Kagame, there was President Museveni. There are leaders who had also fought their way to power. And they didn't fight their way to power from their own countries. They fought from other countries. They fought from outside. So for them, intervention was important. Of course, we can't forget Muammar Gaddafi, pushing for a new Africa, an Africa that is able to address and handle its problems. Otherwise, what is Pan-Africanism for if this solidarity is not also to address our problems? And so we see this shift. And then we also see that these new wars, terrorism and extremist violence cannot be addressed by one member state. They are beyond borders. They are global. They are causing displacement. We have seen our young people crossing the Mediterranean because of the challenges in the Sahel and drowning. This can't be addressed by one state. Some of them are getting kidnapped in the north of the continent, smuggled. We have seen migrants from the Horn of Africa going down through this country to South Africa, smuggled. And so there are these new challenges caused by conflict, climate change. We have seen the challenges in Central African Republic, Chad, with the drying up of the Chad River. And so there are lots of challenges. And where do these people find solace? Some of them have found solace in religious leaders, in extremist thought, in anyone that offers them hope. I come from a place in Kenya where we have interesting men. We had Elijah Masinde in the colonial days who led the fight for independence. And how did he start? It said he was playing football and he hit a ball so high up, to date it has not come back to the ground. And the people believed and followed him, and he led them to fight for independence. Recently, we have had Jehovah Wanyonyi, a real Jehovah, so his followers believe. At the moment, we have Yesu Watongaren. There's Yesu there, and he has followers. There are people who are prostrating for Yesu. And you see Elijah Masinde using religion to fight for independence, and these others using religion in different ways. And you have read about the Shakahola tragedy, where people have been made to starve to death, but the leaders don't starve. In fact, the leader was complaining that the police were not giving him food. Yeah? He doesn't want to go and meet the Creator himself. And you can see that religion can be exploited and used for other reasons. And who are these that are exploited? The poor, the wretched of the earth, that the government has not reached, because how for many months, over a year, people were dying and the government had no idea. You can see that these people have set themselves apart from government and they're exposed to those influences. And so you can see that religion can be used not as a force for good, yet it can be used as a force of good for mobilization. And from the colonial days, we had regions where there were no resources, and therefore the colonial government did not construct any infrastructure. They did not build any infrastructure because there was nothing to extract. And unfortunately, this continued in many of our countries after independence. I was born in Kitale in Kenya, and we have the Turkana of northern Kenya. And when we met them, our neighbors, they would say, I'm coming from Lodwar, I'm going to Kenya. You see? They're in the same country, but they don't see themselves as being Kenyan. But after oil was discovered there recently, we all embrace them as Kenyans. And so there are those peripheries where the government has not reached, the government services have not reached. And those are regions on the continent that are experiencing exposure and influence of religious extremism, promising them good life, or inciting them to fight for a better life for themselves. But there are also the places where other forms of insurgency originate. And that, from the days of independence, the coups that are taking place, you see, there was always the story about marginalization. We've been left out, we're missing out, corruption, and all that. So those people left out have led have led lives of desolation and have been easily been influenced and rebelled against the state. And so, even as we think about tackling terrorism and extremist violence and all other challenges to the state, we have to think about economic transformation, because military solutions alone don't work. We have to work to bring jobs to create jobs for our young people, and to get them to work, to get them to have hope and trust in the state, a state which itself in a dilemma, which itself facing challenges. And so we see the state being unable to maintain law and order in most of these places. And those are issues that states have to grapple with to survive. And in the need to survive, the states have sought support from elsewhere. That the African state that was so vehement about protecting their sovereignty are now seeking support from outside. And we know that the war on terror and other challenges from violent extremism have caused a lot of transformation of the approach that the North has, or for example, the powers in the North have in engaging with the South. That you see on the continent, countries states that the North did not engage with initially, now being engaged. You see that even where it was thought that there was no democracy, there's a blind eye being turned to that because of the fight against extremism. We don't want violent extremism. We want to check it. Because if it's there, we'll have migrants from Africa coming to the North. We will have terrorism being imported to the North. We saw in Hungary, the Prime Minister saying, no, we'll let in, but this religion and not the other. When those labels come up. And so we have seen these challenges. And the states in the Sahel have sought external support. States in the Horn of East Africa have received external support. And so the states are seeking support from outside and not from inside. We also see a challenge in Central African Republic that the state is even seeking to prop itself with the support of private security contractors, the Wagner Group. And so the questions that emanate from these is, where are the people? Is democracy on the cross because the state wants to sustain itself? And who are these people? Their own people. And so these challenges come in, and the question then is, which way Africa? Which way should Africa go? And we also see a shift that initially the West and the North would even the UN would come to Africa to keep peacekeeping missions. But we see a change that we are no longer just seeking to keep peace, but we are moving now to stabilization. That these peacekeepers, who are now no longer peacekeepers, can engage militarily. We want to stabilize. The UN mission, for example, in South Sudan is also, the UNDP is also there to stabilize. UNDP is there to stabilize. DRC, we see stabilization. And the question then is, who do the leaders pay their loyalty to? Where do they gain their legitimacy? And we see this challenge on the continent that even when our leaders get elected, a ticket to the White House gives them legitimacy. When we have election observers, the media doesn't even pay attention to EAC, Africa Union observers. They want to see what the EU said. Where do we get their legitimacy? That is an important issue. And we see, of course, the changing dynamics that I've just mentioned, and that then we see then this convergence between the African leaders, elite, and external actors on intervention and stabilization. And a number of issues also come up, and we ask ourselves that maybe is foreign intervention a pointer that regional integration and African solidarity have failed? Because our leaders said that unless we work together, we'll perish. And anyway, why do we integrate? We also integrate to reinforce our sovereignty. We integrate to strengthen our economies. We integrate to strengthen our bargaining power, our negotiation power. And yet, if we look at most of our regional organizations, RECs, regional economic communities on the continent, we integrate to ask for support from outside. It's just another layer of getting support from outside. And I'll give an example. If you look at the EAC, for example, partner states only pay salaries and emoluments for staff. Thank you. Yes. Partner states only pay salaries. Who pays for everything else? Development partners. The thinking, policy documents are done by development partners. So basically, the EAC is paying staff to work on advancing foreign priorities. And this happens. We have the African Union, the African Peace and Security Architecture. We have the Peace Fund. And that African countries are only contributing a quarter. Who contributes the rest? If anything, at the AU, the Peace Commissioner held the most lucrative position because there were resources, donor resources that everyone wanted. That who pays for peace on the continent? We don't pay for it. And this is a big challenge for the continent. Because without peace, nothing else can take place. Insecurity is a big challenge on the continent. And if this peace is being secured externally, then there is a serious challenge on the continent. Of course, the continent has tried to address these issues. We have seen the African Peace and Security Architecture, the early warning mechanisms across the RECs. But what happens after these warnings? Is it just warnings for their own sake? Do African states have the capacity to address the situation? Do they have the capacity to address conflict? And I come back to the EAC also. Look, because it's an example at home, we have the DRC having joined the EAC. We're trying to address the challenge there. But even before that, there was the enlargement that brought in South Sudan, a conflict we have not addressed. And so we see that our regional organizations lack the capacity because maybe the EAC should only enlarge and let in new members that are in conflict if the EAC has the capacity to address those conflicts. Because if you don't have the capacity, then the whole region gets affected because the pace of integration is as good as that in the weakest member. And so the state is facing all these challenges. There is African institutions who, in the spirit of African solidarity, are supposed to help us to address these challenges that also face a challenge. But then someone could also argue that regional organizations are as good as their members. And so it's time for African states maybe to make these tough decisions, that we need to have regional institutions that work. We need to stabilize our region, but as we stabilize our region, we should not forget about the interests of the people, the rights of the people, that as we are stabilized, as we get external support, what are we paying in return? Are we losing the independence we fought for? Can we afford? And what should the state do? The state needs to survive. Will the state continue seeking this external support? And as Aristotle said, the state exists for the sake of good life, not just for the sake of life only, for the sake of good life, not just for life only. And African states have largely been surviving for life only, and the point is that even the people within the states are not guaranteed that life because of exposure to these insecurities. And so the African state is at a crossroads, trying to survive within the challenging environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Wanyama Masinde, who has just completed to give his keynote address on African state sovereignty at bay, religion, insurgency, and foreign intervention. I'm not going to repeat what he has said, but rather to invite Dr. Rasul to give his presentation. Welcome to the podium. You have 15 minutes.
I have my presentation in a PowerPoint because I'm going to share some figures. So it's important that we have. Thank you so much. Of course, I'm part of the organizers. I did not self-appoint myself to come here. I thank the chair of Mwalimu Nyerere for inviting me to make a presentation today. Once again, all protocol observed. Professor Wanyama, I thank you for coming because you have made my task easy. You have answered some of the questions in my presentation, so some of the things that I had planned to say, I will just skip them. Okay, we can continue. The title of my presentation is Regional Security Arrangements, Are They Toothless Paper Tigers or Empowering Instruments of African States? If you look at this title, it's directly taking you to the Afro pessimism, optimism debate. And you'll be asking yourself, is at the end of this presentation, is the presenter bringing optimism to the African Ken, or is he another prophet of the doom? I leave it out to you to make a judgment at the end of the presentation. But you can. The focus of my presentation is on both the regional arrangement, the AU, and the sub-regional arrangements, the likes of ECOWAS, SADC, EAC, etc. Because you cannot talk about these sub-regional arrangements without looking at the continental peace and security architecture. So this is how I've planned to go through the presentation. After the introduction, I will go straight to the state of peace and security in Africa, and then I'll touch a bit on the assessment approaches. I'll go to the assessing the capacity of African regional security arrangements, and that will take much of my time, and then I'll make a conclusion. That's how I plan to go. After this introduction, the state of peace and security in Africa, then assessing the capacity of African regional security arrangements, and then the conclusion. As I've said a few seconds ago, my focus will be on regional and sub-regional arrangements. And we are told when the when the OAU commemorated its 50th anniversary, the heads of state made a pledge that we should be able to silence the guns by 2020, the year 2020. We are now into 2023. The guns are still blazing. Okay, so that's a missed target. We have had this slogan, African solutions to African problems. I'm not going to go to the 3 schools of thought to save time. But since the replacement of the OAU by AU, there have been this paradigm shift from the principle of non-interference to principle of non-indifference. Someone has said this is a replacement of sovereignty as impunity with sovereignty as responsibility. But Africa has its peculiar interpretation of the responsibility to protect. The first responsibility goes to the state. If the state fails, then the responsibility devolves to the African Union. But this slogan, African solutions for African problems, the interpretation has somehow softened with the extent of the challenges Africa has gone through. Now they welcome external actors, but with the African actors as the lead in resolving and managing conflicts. So the slogan is, the interpretation has softened a bit. Now let me go to the second part of the presentation, that is the state of peace and security in Africa. I'm making reference to the Heidelberg Institute for International Conflict Research. I prefer this data set as opposed to the other ones. You know, the popular one is the Uppsala, etc., etc. Why this one? Because they focus on conflict processes rather than purely quantitative thresholds of casualties. They look at actors, measures, and issues. Now, they have 5 levels of intensity, okay, of conflict intensity. They start with disputes, level 1, non-violent crisis, violent crisis, limited war, and then war. Now, let us look at the figures now. Their latest data is saying in 2022, there are 90 active conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa, which is an increase of 3 compared to the previous year. Overall, there are 59 conflicts which were on a violent level. There are 15 wars. 2 of those have de-escalated to the level of limited war. And then there were 5 limited wars. And as in the previous year, that 2021, Sub-Saharan Africa was the region with the most observed conflicts at war level. You look at the global conflict panorama, Sub-Saharan Africa leads. So if you go to other data sets, it will give you close to that picture. One dispute in the DRC has escalated to a full-scale war, and then 3 full-scale wars have de-escalated to limited wars. These are in Mozambique, DRC, and in Nigeria. 4 limited wars de-escalated to the level of violent crisis, and 2 violent crises escalated to limited wars. So you have all these movements, data along the 5 indices of intensity of conflict. Now, when I was given this assignment to prepare a presentation, I say, it's a difficult task. So how am I going to approach this? There are 3 approaches. Whether you compare an existing, we compare conflict management activities of an existing institution, and then you assess the extent to which they present an improvement from the previous. So at this level, you can compare OAU and AU, and I can say the AU is a much more improvement. Even though the OAU, the bar was set at very low, the OAU. But second way of assessing the capability of African regional security arrangement is judging practices against their stated goals and aspirations as codified in their policies, in their protocols and other instruments. And thirdly is to evaluate the extent to which they have actually resolved Africa's peace and security challenges and crises in particular places. The instruments I'm going to go through in the next slide, one after another if time allows, I think I'm going to use the last two approaches. There are principally 5 main instruments from the international, continental level to sub-regional level for conflict management. Professor Wanyama has touched on the early warning and response systems. You have mediation initiatives and roadmaps, sanctions regimes, peacekeeping missions. Of course, we have now in process the African standby force. But I'll talk about, because of time, I'll talk about the first 4. The continental early warning system remains a work in progress because the essential ingredients are falling into place. Now they have an operational situation room. All over the continent, they have only 10 situation rooms. The latest data I have, only 10 for the entire continent. And these situation rooms can provide continent-wide coverage of conflict dynamics 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They feed information about political instability to the Peace and Security Council of the AU. And they were in the process of developing indicators of threats, vulnerabilities, and risks to the civilians. Now, this continental early warning system is not without its challenges. It's facing a lot of challenges. Some of them is that it has struggled to develop what is called interoperability with the regional economic communities, because these regional economic communities have their own early warning system, which are at various stages of development. I think the most developed one is the IGAD one, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And also, it receives insufficient real-time diplomatic reporting and intelligence because it does not have its own diplomatic channel. So you have to rely on states. And as the keynote speaker has said, the regional organization, the AU, is as good as its members. Okay? Senior and media level leadership cannot easily access national and supranational intelligence sources. And there is this problem of widespread anxiety among AU member states, because they think that you can use early warning as a justification for spying. Okay? And there's a report, I'm not going to mention the countries, some countries, they've even in the recent past, requested this situation room to turn off when there is a bad situation in their country, because they don't want bad publicity. Okay? And there is also a problem, the challenge of the difficulty of analyzing information, using it to influence decision making within. It was not possible to analyze the information. They had information, they could not analyze it in time to use it in the 2007 post-election crisis in Kenya, or in the 2008 Guinea-Bissau instability. It could not be used by then. It was operational by then already. The second instrument we're talking about, mediation initiatives. These days they like to use the word roadmaps. Everywhere, roadmap. Now, I just read the AU roadmap on Sudan. Very impressive, but look at the situation in Sudan. Now, wherever you go in Africa, African mediators face these three organizational constraints. 1, competition among mediators. 2, tension between African and international mediators. And 3, weak resource capacities. I'm going to take you through quickly each of these. Competition among mediators. This is the case where you have multiple mediators seeking to intervene in conflicts without coordination. And it is already happening in the Sudan crisis. And in the roadmap they are saying, we want to avoid that. They are stating somewhere, because now they are involving, it has started by the US and Saudi Arabia, now, and the other, Norway, etc. Now they are saying, we don't want more mediators to come in. So this is the case. Case examples are multiple in Burundi, in the DRC, and Sudan. In one of these case studies I will touch on briefly, you will see this. The second one is tension between African mediators and external actors. In the Great Lakes region, some mediators have complained of the excessive intrusiveness of Western envoys on local processes. You know, they want to control the process, but they will face this pressure from the external actors who have a vested interest in the conflict. And there's the problem of inadequate resources. African mediators face the dilemma of inadequate financial resources to competently organize and sustain mediation. So when they look for external resources, they are likely to incorporate the views of external actors during the negotiation. A very good example where all these three organizational constraints have been experienced is in this one. The AU-UN Joint Mediation Support Team in the Darfur conflict. And the person we're going to, the chair is going to give an award tomorrow, was very much involved. Dr. Salim Ahmed Salim. First he was involved with the, I think, Korean Foreign Minister, Pronk, and then the Dutch, he was the Dutch Foreign Minister. And then he was replaced by someone called Ellison. So the Salim-Pronk partnership and the later Salim-Ellison partnership was always trying in the Darfur conflict to preempt the problem of competitive mediation initiatives. So the point I'm making to you here is, it's not only about the documents you have, they're very impressive. Sometimes these are the vested interests in the conflict. They faced the escalation of mediators from Libya, Eritrea, Chad, which had considerable influence on some of the parties. Because they could not forge any unity, they could not bring the parties to the table, then they resigned. They resigned in June 2008. And then the AU and UN appointed another mediator, who was the ex-Burkinabé foreign minister, Djibril Bassole. This coincided with the emergence of Qatar as a major player, in the Darfur mediation. So this newly appointed mediator was overshadowed by Qatar, which had massive financial muscle and influence on the parties. I think I will go through, because I have less than 5 minutes, I will go through the Libyan crisis and then go to the peacekeeping issue. The UN, you recall UN Resolution 173 of 2011, which imposed a no-fly zone on Libya, which was initially enforced by the Stuttgart-based AFRICOM, and then NATO took full command under Operation Unified Protector. Now, the funny thing about this, the AU appointed a high-level panel, a committee of 6 presidents, to go to Libya. You know what happened? The first time they tried, they were denied permission by NATO to go to Libya. So they had to relocate to Mauritania. Okay? This was very embarrassing. Finally, they were later allowed to go to Libya. Now, these are the words of one of the presidents who was there, Museveni. The refusal to grant permission was decried by President Museveni, who said, and I quote, "It was contemptuous of NATO to prevent a team of 6 presidents with the AU mandate to try and resolve the Libya issue from traveling to the country. African presidents on African soil carrying out an African mission were ordered by NATO to go back." Okay? This was a contempt. It was contemptuous. So sometimes African mediators face that one. But let's not only spare the AU. What about the AU roadmap for Libya? Yes, Gaddafi accepted the AU roadmap, but the National Transitional Council in Benghazi did not. There are several reasons that are given, I won't go through, but some are saying, my professor will remember there, using the Hartman, Professor Hartman's, Zatman's mutual hurting settlement had not been reached by then. Some are making that argument. But did the roadmap reflect Africa's common position on the crisis? Because there were some African members in the Security Council who voted for the resolution 1973, which imposed a no-fly zone on Libya. And you remember Kagame's open criticism later on AU's tepid response. I will not go through the ECOWAS and Mali or ECAS and or EAC mediation of the Burundi. You know, in EAC in Burundi, Nkurunziza had just extended his term limit, and then they appoint President Museveni to be the mediator. It was funny. So there's a lack of regional convergence of norms is lacking. Given the limited time, I don't know, 2 more minutes or no more? Okay, let me go to the conclusion then. I'm making a conclusion that, does not depart from what Professor Wanyama said. Regional security arrangements, practical capabilities suffer from a persistent capabilities expectations gap. They suffer from a persistent capabilities expectation gap. They are falling short of the ambitious vision and rhetoric contained in their founding documents. The good thing is that the process of internal review and reform has started since 2016. You remember the Kagame report of 2017. It laid out a series of institutional reforms, and one of the apparent, the visible conclusion from this, finding from this report is that there is a crisis of implementation within the African peace and security architecture. Okay? Lastly, this is my last slide. Africa still faces this, the tensions between national sovereignty and intergovernmentalism. But if you are to, I'm proposing, if you are to move forward, we have to borrow the wisdom of Olusegun Obasanjo, who said that you have ABSA on one side and AGA, Africa Governance Architecture, on the other side. These are two sides of the same coin. Okay? So these two sides of the same coin must be accorded equal priority. While AGA focuses on broader questions of governance, ABSA places emphasis on the mechanism for conflict management, resolution, and peace building. These two must work together to bring about peace and security in the continent. So all components of the ABSA must be equally implemented for a more coherent and comprehensive approach to managing peace and security in Africa. I thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rasul Minja, for the lecture the paper that you have presented, or topic on regional security arrangements. Are they toothless paper tigers or empowering instruments of African states? Now I would like to invite Dr. Masabo to present on insurgency threats to national and regional security, the case of Mozambique. You have 15 minutes, Dr. Masabo, at most 20 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lucy, the chair of this session, my professors present here, the vice chair of CIP Africa, Mama Balozi, Honorable Zakia Megji, distinguished guests or participants, ladies and gentlemen. My task today is quite challenging because I've been given the subject that has been topical in our region for some time. And many have researched on it, and a lot has been written about it. And it's difficult to get and add new value in it, but I'll try. What to be presented today is part of the finding of ongoing research project that is conducted by CIP Africa on the state of security in southern Tanzania and northern Mozambique. So, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to draw your attention on the theme and the task that perfectly sits well on the overall address that has been provided by Professor Wanyama on African state sovereignty and flowing from the previous presentation by my senior, Dr. Minja, with equal respect to his brilliant expose. I wish to tease out some few issues that we've got to think about. First, there is general public perception, or at least in the media, they want us to believe that the religion or the religion question is central to insurgents in Cabo Delgado. Here, I would like to propose a takeaway that we need to deal with this perception because it tends to weaponize religion, while at the same time vitiates and cloud our own analysis. So we've got to rethink a little bit. And secondly, what is the effectiveness of our religion security arrangements? Are they effective or what? Because Dr. Minja did not provide us with the answers. He just left us with food for thought. So do we like to empower? Does it need empowerment? That's what I would leave it with you as well. And thirdly, and this is central to my own discussion theme, what are the threats represented by the situation in Mozambique? Are they only national, or do they have regional impact? I will deal with these three themes in order have been presented. So a response to each of these queries will all together with specific cases in Mozambique present us with a full construct of our today's theme, Pan-Africanism and the quest for democratization, security, and development. Most of us knows that the Ansar Sunni, or popularly known in Mozambique as Al-Shabaab of Mozambique, insurgents in Cabo Delgado, started in 2017. And they have evolved from non-violent sect to terror, hit and run, to insurgents that controls many kilometers of land. The evolution of these insurgents in Mozambique informs us more threatening new dimension to our regional security complex. And in the Great Lakes region of Eastern Africa and along the Indian Ocean. So we've got to be very careful with it. But just to dramatize a little bit, in terms of proximity, as it was presented this morning, if I may be allowed to say, Cabo Delgado is in Mtwara. Yes, it is in Mtwara. What separates is Ruvuma River, but the population of both sides are relatives. Thirdly, Cabo Delgado is a province that their liberation was planned and strategized from Mtwara and Lindi. Not to mention that we share gas. They have 200 cubic liters. We have 57 along our side. So if I may to say is that we are conjoined in the hip, historically, economically, culturally, geographically, and through the gas. In Cabo, the three biggest towns are Pemba, Palma, and Musimbo da Praia, to which was fully under the control of the the insurgents until August 2021, when it was liberated by Rwandan contingent SADC forces in collaboration with the Mozambique army. At the beginning, the terrorists attacks government installations, and the Mozambique government did a little, because it took the insurgents months to capture 2.5 districts, and after 5 months, 4 districts were under their control. And the government of Mozambique hired the Dickey Advisory Group from South Africa and the famous Wagner Group from Russia to secure those areas, to which they failed miserably, and their contracts were terminated. As we all followed the development, the Mozambique government was hesitant to ask for security support. And when the situation deteriorated by 2020-2021, some analysts posit that the government was deceived first by Dickey and Wagner, that they have capabilities to overcome the terrorists. Some suggested that the government did not want to threaten investors. Some suggested that the government wanted to protect Cabo Delgado from illegal politico-economic activities from curious eyes from the SADC and the rest of the world. So Tanzania received a lot of people from Cabo Delgado, but we returned them so that they could be relocated into safer areas within the Cabo Delgado. We all recall that President Nyusi went and asked Rwanda to help, which he got quite quickly. And this is part of the Rwandan strategy, to project itself as a player of reference in security operations in the continent, because it's been in operation in Central Africa, in Mali, in many other areas in Africa. True enough, 1 week into their being in Cabo Delgado, Musimbo da Praia was liberated or being retaken. Then the SADC forces under which Tanzania operated was allowed into Mozambique to reinforce the military operation against the insurgents. The Mozambique armed forces have detached 600 soldiers to secure the installations, and the Rwanda positioned 2,000 soldiers and police by 2021. As we speak, the Rwandan contingent is about 3,000 people in Cabo Delgado. The Total Energies, that the company that operates us in Palma, has commissioned this year a review of the situation and appointed its own security analyst to help in identifying emerging issues and methods on how to deal with them. The expert, Mr. Jean Ruffin, the president of a French NGO and who also has worked with Médecins Sans Frontières for some time. And in his report, just released May this year, he identified the following drivers of the conflict in Cabo Delgado. Number one, inequalities between south and north of the country. Number two, ethnic rivalries between the Makonde, the Mwani, and the Makua. Legacies of Frelimo Renamo War, lack of public services, questions around access to land and natural resources, because the, come on, Lucy, it's only 5 minutes. And lastly, international jihadists. The further analysis of the dissect suggests that most of these drivers roam around what CIP Africa was calling around the crisis of governance. So Mozambique suffers the crisis of governance. Subsequently, the report recommended actions to be taken by Total Energies. Number one, the creation of fund of 200 million euros for 10 years for CSRs in Cabo Delgado, starting around Palma and radiating through the province. Secondly, by bringing these 200 million, that means each year the Total Energies will be giving the NGOs in Mozambique 20 million euros per year as CSR, in a province where the government is allocating only 5 million euro per year. I think we are seeing it clear that at the end, the government will be unpopular automatically, because the NGOs, they will be powerful and they'll be delivering what the government cannot. The report also proposed that the Rwanda forces should cut ties with the government forces and they should be working for Total Energies alone. So they will be commissioned in the area around the LNG plant. What we are seeing here is a bad response to the crisis of governance in Mozambique. And also the presence of Rwanda and the Rwandan army in the Musimbo da Praia and Palma would thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Masabo, for the lecture, or rather a talk, or rather a presentation that you have just given on insurgency threats to national and regional security with the case of Mozambique. If we look, or from listening from the three presenters, it's clear that the three presentations, they picked up quite well from the morning's keynote speaker. And I would wish to open for discussion. We have, I think, with the permission of Chair, 15 minutes. And we'll take a round of comments and questions. I kindly request that we don't exceed 1 minute. If we exceed, I will just stop you from speaking so that we can have as much comments and questions as possible. And then in the end, I'll give the speakers time to respond to the observations and questions. I've seen the hand from the lady at the end, and then you'll be the second.
Thank you, presenters. I only had a concern. What is the difference between insurgency and terrorism? Because the first presenter talked about terrorism and the last one talked about insurgency. So when does one become the other, or are they two different things? And then I had a concern, a brief concern. When we say terrorism and extremism, how do you define terror? You know, there was a song, now you talk about terror, and I've been terrorized all my days. How do you define terror? Winnie Mandela was a terrorist. Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. How do we dare today still use this word? Do we need to find new words, or is it still a relevant word? Or are we prolonging the colonization of even the language in which we seek to liberate ourselves? Thank you.
Thank you. If you can kindly introduce yourself so that the presenters can know whom are they addressing to.
My name is Diana Kamara.
Okay. Are you addressing to any of them or specific presenter?
First and last.
All right, thank you. I'll give the microphone to that, and then Professor Peter.
Thank you. My name is Ezeus Thomas Ponsian, and I'm a student of political science and public administration. So I would kindly ask my teacher, Dr. Rasuli Minja, that I should ask a question, because also my teacher. So one of the things that was also provided by the presenter, it seems like we have the security architecture in Africa, which are quite viable, that the aim is to make sure that we have peace and security in the continent as well. But still, we have these insurgents, and we keep having this, like what we say, limited wars and violence in nature and stuff like that. So if we are to ask ourselves that we have this security architecture that are quite there to make sure that the continent is quite at peace, and yet the security architecture from the presentation that most of you have provided, we still have, and are not quite giving to what it's supposed to be. So what directly the future of the security architecture? Do we actually need this security architecture, or do we actually need to reform this security architecture, or what should be done? And what is your take on that? What should be done in totality?
Thank you very much. Professor Peter.
Thank you very much. My question is directed at Dr. Minja. If you look at the two periods, 1963 to 2002, during the OAU and the African Union, you didn't dwell much on the African Union, on the OAU period. Save for the wars between between Tanzania and the Uganda and the Biafran War. Most of the conflicts were really wars of national liberation during that period. And these were wars which are legitimate under international law. Unlike when we look now. Now, without inviting you to commit treason, if you compare the rulers, I don't call them leaders, the rulers in the OAU and the rulers and the African Union, don't you think that the rulers during the OAU were more serious? Because I couldn't see NATO stopping Nkrumah or Mwalimu, but they could do that later on. Can you comment on that? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I would give a microphone to that gentleman, and then I think he'll be the last one, since there are no any other hands.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Rashid Kasim. I do have a question, especially to Dr. Rasul. How far do you think that the AU can achieve the goals? Taking an example of the most successful regional integration like EU, who the members are just trying to engage to another military alliances like NATO. And besides, this is the most successful regional integration. So how do you think Africa we can achieve if those most successful regional integrations are still engaging to other security mechanisms?
If you can a bit clarify, because Dr. Minja did not get it briefly, what did you want him to
Well, my question was, how do you think AU or Africans, how can we achieve our goals if the most successful regional integration like EU are engaging to other security mechanism, engaging to NATO, for example? So how can we Africa achieve those if EU, the most successful regional integration, have failed to achieve those security, their goals, I mean?
Yes, to that gentleman, and then he'll be, okay, you'll be the next person.
Jina langu naitwa Aishi Hussein Mashaka, ni mwanafunzi wa mwaka wa kwanza, nachukua political science and history. Na comment also na swali. Katika ili Mwalimu Nyerere katika kitabu chake cha Tujisahihishe aliposema kwamba daktari mbaya ni yule ambaye anatoa dawa au anamponya mgonjwa pasi na kujua ugonjwa anaumwa huyo mgonjwa. Huyo daktari hatari sana. Maneno haya yanafanana na maneno ya Sun Tzu aliyozungumza katika kitabu chake cha Arts of the War karne 4 kabla hajazaliwa Yesu. Alisema kwamba washindi hushinda kwanza ndio akaenda vitani, wakati walioshindwa huenda vitani wakatafuta ushindi. Hii ina maana kwamba katika nchi zinazoendelea kama sisi hasa za Kiafrika tunapambana na maadui ambao watu hawajui. Maadui yetu wamesimama katika sehemu 4. Wamekaa katika social, political, economic and ideology. Katika ideology wamejificha sana katika masuala ya education, social media na katika masuala kama vile religion. Sababu dini zinatumika sana katika kugawanya. Angalia migogoro inaendelea Mozambiki, nyingi inatumia kivuli cha dini. Angalia migogoro ambayo inaendelea sasa hivi Nigeria, nyingi inatumia kivuli cha dini. Lakini katika economic ni katika masuala multinational corporations, these companies, through investment. Angalia migogoro ambayo inaendelea Mozambiki sasa hivi. Tatizo ni nini? Ukiangalia katika uchumi katika hizi nchi ambazo zinaitwa Palma, ambazo zinapatikana northern part of Mozambique, hizi jamii zina Waislamu wengi, alafu also ndio zinaongoza kwa umaskini. Sasa panapopatikana resources inakuwa ni rahisi kuwatumia watu hawa kwa kuwapandikiza chuki na kuaminisha kwamba if mkatumia dini yetu kwamba tukampambana kwa ajili kesho kutwa mtakuwa na maisha mazuri. Na katika social wanakuja na vitu vingi hasa katika masuala ya ideologies. Yaani vitu vingi ambavyo vya kuchanganya hasa vya kijamii. Haya yote yanatengeneza uwanja mpana wa nchi zetu za Kiafrika kushindwa kujikwamua katika nchi katika kutoka katika makucha migogoro, umaskini na kadhalika. Sasa katika dunia tulionayo sasa hivi ni dunia ambayo inaongozwa kwa akili kubwa sana. Sasa swali ambalo la kuwauliza hasa walimu wangu walisema mbele yangu ni kwamba
swali lako unalielekeza kwa nani?
Kwa dokta.
Dr. nani?
Yeah.
Rasul.
Kwamba kwa sasa hivi sasa katika hizi nchi zinazoendelea especially katika nchi za Kiafrika hatuoni sasa huu ni muda mwafaka wa kuanza kuwafundisha wanafunzi kufikiri na sio kukariri, na kupitia hilo linakamilishwaje?
Asante kwa swali lako. Karibu mzee.
Naitwa Dani Kingi, miaka 31 nilikuwa hapa. Mimi niko baffled. Kabla ya kwenda lunch, we had some lecturers here talking about democracy. But at this age, I feel I am tired over the definition of democracy. Russia claims to be democratic. Italy says it is democratic. English, though monarchical, says it is democratic. Tanzania says we are democratic. Kenya says they are more democratic than Tanzania. Uganda, democratic. We had just a definition of the Greek, kwamba it is for the people, of the people, and people, and people, and people, and everything. My please, anyone, Wanyama, this man, Rasul, because you are here, can you help me get out of this word democracy? Where does democracy from the Greeks between Russia and China, who is more democratic? Asante sana.
Asante kwa swali lako. Sasa I will welcome the presenters. Professor will be the last one. I will reverse the order, but I will give 3 minutes each. Dr. Masabo, I would wish if you can respond on the role of SADC in Mozambique. If you can provide some reflections. How do you see SAMIM and its role in Mozambique and the future of regional security? And then I'll welcome Dr. Minja to respond to the questions which have been raised.
Thank you. With Lucy's question, mine too. The difference between terrorism and insurgents. Diana. To make it simple, terror, most of them terrorists, they do operate on hit and run basis. They do not acquire and maintain territory. The maintenance and acquisition of territory differentiate differentiate the terror from insurgents. Doctor, you asked about SADC. Samim is doing a brilliant job. He's doing a brilliant job. And that's why it entered with 3 months mandate, and which is extended because the insurgents now have turned into being terrorists, and they have spread the entire northern and central parts of Mozambique. Some have tried even to cross to Tanzania. Last few months they tried to attack somewhere called Michenjele, but they were naturalized. But they do operate in Ngade, in Mozambique, Niassa, Mtopwezi. In those areas, they are still in operation, but on hit-and-run basis. For that case, the SADC force is still needed because it is reinforcing security in the area, and secondly, it is also needed because it is assisting the Rwandese forces on the northern part of Mozambique, at Musimbo da Praia and Palma. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Masabo. I'll now invite Dr. Minja to respond to the questions. 3 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all those who commented on my paper and the other panelists. I'll start with I didn't get the name, the PSPA student who asked about, do we actually need the security architecture? You are referring to African peace and security architecture. I think my conclusion was very clear that Africa peace and security architecture suffers from a persistent, expectation capability gap, but it doesn't mean that the African peace and security architecture has not made any strides. They have made several strides in the instruments that I mentioned in my presentation. Yes, the continental early warning system is a work in progress, but it's operational, it's up and running. They have mooted a peace fund. Yes, the balance still reads negative. The target is to reach $400 million, I think. The last time I checked, it was 240. So they are doing something, But what I was saying towards the end is the African peace and security architecture and the African governance architecture, they are two sides of the same coin. You cannot address one and leave the other. You have to address the governance side also. So we actually need it. And I think even Masabo was saying I was not coming out clearly the takeaway that are these paper tigers, or I left it out because I think the conclusion says it's all, and even Professor Wanyama was saying they are facing a capability challenge. Thank you so much, Professor Maina. You want me to commit treason? Compare the period 1963 to 2002, and you see maybe those leaders, the early statesmen, were more serious than today's. If you take the numbers that Dr. Lupa shared with us on the coups, in one region only, West Africa. In West Africa, I think it's the regional organization ECOWAS is the one which has imposed, suspended its members for unconstitutional change of government. Only 4 countries have been spared. Nigeria, Ghana, I don't remember the other 2. Only 4. If you go by those statistics, these are not serious. These are not serious leaders. But wait a minute. The challenges they faced are not the same. By then, today, intrastate conflicts are the most persistent threat than interstate conflicts of those years. And these, there are 3 key variables which determine and shape the dynamics of intrastate conflicts in contemporary Africa. One is the manipulation of ethnic identity. 2 is the competition of access and distribution of resources, and 3, regionalization of these conflicts. Most of these conflicts have a spillover effect. They have a spillover effect. So the challenges that they faced those days are completely different. So on that note, I cannot completely conclude that they maybe they are not as serious as their forefathers. This guy wants me to compare the AU and EU, I don't know, on issues of security. These are two different organizations with different security peculiarities. NATO is a different animal altogether. I think you need. I need to have well thought parameters to compare these two. But you have there which on one hand you say these two are not comparable, given the capacity constraints they are facing, the African peace and security architecture. But on the other hand, you have organizations like EAC, which have copied almost all the structures from the AU. Not all, I'm saying it has copied most of the structures, but even within the AU, you have innovative structures like the Peace and Security Council, which has no veto powers and no permanent members. But intriguingly, you have one country which has always become a member of the Peace and Security Council, Nigeria. And the AU is just looking at this. I mean, Nigeria is always a member of the Peace and Security Council, but there is a rotational principle within the AU. Mashaka kwa sasa hivi wanafunzi, nafikiri hilo ni swali lilikuwa directed kwa acting Vice Chancellor Professor Boniface, angekuwa bado tuko nasi angejibu, lakini tunafundisha. Mimi nafikiri hata wewe darasani tunakufundisha kufikiri na sio kukariri. You are baffled about the Ukraine, I don't know. I'll leave that to Professor Wanyama if you can comment. Mzee pale yuko baffled with the situation in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rasool, for responding to the questions. Now, Professor, as a way of concluding, can the promotion of Pan-Africanism guarantee promotion of security and development and security in Africa?
Thank you very much, Session Chair. And maybe I could also just touch on a few other issues. And one is the case of the EU and NATO. We also need to go back and look at the origins of the EU, the European Coal and Steel Community. While it sought to secure peace in Europe, it started as a business organization to trade. And so it evolved separately from NATO's evolution. And so those were different, separate entities that have evolved over time, and it's good to look at their history and know what they're doing. And while we have picked a lot from the EU, you look at the African Union, we're dealing with we have the peace and security architecture, which is different from the EU, and so they don't mirror each other in the way that you are looking at it, and it's good to go and look at it a little further. And just before I come to that again, we look at democracy. Democracy is a journey, is a continuum, it's a process. We have young democracies and we have older democracies, but even the older democracies do have turbulence, do face turbulence, and we see Trump and his insurrection. So when someone says we are better democracy than yours, then it depends on where the person is standing and what they're looking at. And it's a journey, and we have no perfect democracy yet, but we're working towards that. And when we're talking about insurgents, these groups that pick up arms against government, and we have different forms of insurgencies which could incorporate all these groups, even of a terrorist nature. And many people hold different views, and many of these views are sometimes extreme. And when the people pick up arms, then they're becoming violent extremists. And so it's good to go and delve into these issues a little further. I know that the terms can be confusing. And then the question, yes.
Yes, just to tie with our overall theme, can the promotion of Pan-Africanism guarantee the promotion of security and democracy for Africa and sovereignty for African countries?
Absolutely. Pan-Africanism, African solidarity, the future is in our hands. If we don't work together, we will perish. We don't integrate necessarily because we love one another. We integrate because of the benefits that we expect to get, which are to advance our continent as well as the lives of our people back home. And without working together, then we were veering away from the aspirations of our founding fathers. And together, we will prosper. On our own, we open ourselves to external influences, some which are exploitative. As we read and see what Wagner is doing in the Central African Republic, what China is doing on the continent, it doesn't mean that those that tell us that these are exploiting you are not themselves exploiting us, and have not themselves been exploiting us since before independence until now. And so it's only in working together that we'll be respected, that we will advance our ideals and protect our sovereignty. But it's important that we remember that we should not work together to protect what is undesirable for our people, but we should work together to advance what is good for our people. We should not work together to prop up those that exploit their people, but we should work together to advance those that advance the interests of their people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, our keynote speaker for this panel, Professor Wanyama Masinde, and the two panelists, Dr. Rasul Minja and Dr. Ali Masabo, for this session that we have had. And also should thank the members who are present here, distinguished guests, for the interactions that we've had. I kindly request we put our hands together to conclude this session.
Mwalimu Nyerere, Professor of Pan-African Studies, distinguished guests, all participants, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome again to our second afternoon session. In this panel, we are going to have two presenters. One is Professor Sarah Nsali, who is an associate professor and Dean School of Women and Gender Studies, and the Director, Center of Excellence in Notions of Identity at Makerere University. She's going to make a presentation on gender identity and African citizenship. And another presenter is Mr. Issa Omari from Department of Political Science and Public Administration from University of Dar es Salaam, who is going to make to give his presentation on conflict and reconciliation of competitive identities, Pan-Africanism, Regionalism, and Nationalism. So instead of Professor Mohamed Bakari, this presentation is going to be given by Mr. Omari. So the panel is about construction and the deconstruction of African identity. So please, I hope you enjoy the presentation. Normally the last presentation is going to be very exciting. That's why it is going to be presented at this time. So I hope you enjoy it. So now I'm going to welcome Professor Sarah to give a presentation. You have only 15 minutes. How many minutes do you want? Okay, 20 minutes. You're welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone, or should we say good evening? I'm very privileged to be here. Do we say all protocol observed? So all protocol observed. Greetings to everyone, and I'm very privileged to be here to participate in this Mwalimu Julius Nyerere Intellectual Festival. There are mainly two reasons that excited me when I was picked upon. One is that in Makerere we have the Julius Nyerere Leadership Center, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere Leadership Center, and I am a board member on that. So this gives me an opportunity to see how things around that great icon are done in his homeland. So I was very happy about that. The other reason I was very happy for coming was that it would give me an opportunity to see my old REDET friends. I think all of you who know REDET, it was Research and Education for Democracy in Tanzania. At the time I was involved, it was led by Professor Mkandala. Thereafter, he became a very great man. Each time you had someone from Tanzania would tell you how he had scaled the heights and how he was in high society and not very, very accessible to lay people or common people, but it's good that we are here, and of course with Professor Msambai Katumanga. So I'm also happy and privileged to be giving a lecture on three key concepts that define our society today, and that is gender, identity, and African citizenship. The three concepts are pertinent today as ever before, offering us a lens to reassess the spirit of Pan-Africanism as envisaged by the forefathers, including Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, in whose name we gather today. This paper examines the nexus between the three, highlighting how they are endangered by neoliberal development strategy, which has weakened the state, undermining citizenship rights. It examines the dilemma of neoliberal policies such as decentralization, which, while purporting to articulate people's rights, become the medium of those very rights denial. In this paper, I use dispossession as a central organizing framework to argue that in privatizing African economies, neoliberal reforms have enabled the state to abdicate its responsibilities, but also enlisted the state in undermining the citizens' rights. Briefly defined, according to David Harvey, dispossession or capitalistic accumulation by dispossession refers to neoliberal capitalistic policies that result in the centralization of wealth and power in the hands of a few by taking away what have commonly been known as communal lands and communal properties. And Uganda has had its unfair share of these, either manifesting as land grabbing, or for agriculture, or for environment, or for any other, or mineral extraction. And 30 years of neoliberalism have shown us that while there is some bit of progress, there's also a bit of regression. And the key question today is, how do we achieve national development through dispossession of the majority? And by dispossession here, we are talking about both dispossession by international capital as well as local elite. And I would like to start this by sharing two stories. One is not really disposition, but an illustration of the state's abdication of its role. 2 weeks ago, in the north of the country, that's in Gulu sub-region, a woman gave birth by the roadside after experiencing labor pains on a boda boda. A boda boda is a motorbike form of transport. According to the rider, the condition was so terrible, and he tried to help by rushing this woman to hospital for help. But on reaching the hospital, because it was so terrible, so he couldn't get to the hospital, so he stopped somewhere and rushes to the hospital for help. On reaching the hospital, he was told there's no fuel in the ambulance, the driver's phone was off, and when he went to the maternity ward, he was told all nurses were too busy to attend to someone outside the health facility. And he was at a shock as to whether this was the right response he would have got for trying to be responsible. You all know motorbike transporters are not stereotyped for being the best of people, but he thought he was not received well. So I raise this mainly to show a case of state abdication of the right to care, even when a community member like a boda boda rider has tried to reach out for help. And the few stretched staff, the no fuel in the ambulance, the driver's phone being off, are all matters that have come to characterize our neoliberal health system, which we are accustomed to, but which actually could be better in serving the population. The second case is a clear case of dispossession. And in one village in the east, a group of farmers or a community threatened of losing their land to a big World Bank-funded development project. It's going to be an irrigation dam and largely for growing rice. And to the people's concern is the area is already wetland. Where they are, they do not really eat rice. They grow bananas, they grow millet, they grow other things. So why is the government interested in irrigating an area which never experiences drought? And when they tried to reach out and express these sentiments and say we are interested in partnering with government, but not in things that actually are going to chase us off the land, their response, the response they got from state functionaries at local level was imprisonment. And so that made them actually get more infuriated, and the local leaders' accusation was that they were inciting violence. And to the local people, what is inciting violence when actually all we are doing is organize so that into a land cooperative so that we can negotiate and do things better for the state. But in addition to that, the government local leaders did not want outsiders like CSOs to pay attention to the affairs of this community, because in any case, if you are not an outsider, you don't belong. The community and its people were the only ones to engage in that matter. So identity and citizenship were at the heart of independence. And this raises the question of how did we get to where we are? When people were struggling for independence, whether you're talking about Mwalimu, Julius, Nyerere, Marcos Garvey, Frantz Fanon, all those people who played a role in liberating Africa from the different parts where Africans were, whether you're talking about the continent or you're talking about the Caribbean, black identity was key. Citizenship rights were key. The right to self-determination was key. And these were the ethos around which independence parties were formed. They were trying to respond to years of subjugation, years of oppression based on a racial dichotomy that privileged the white race. So how come that now, many years later, we are going back to dispossession, this time not by the white man, but the major agent leading the dispossession is the African local elite or the African local leader, who is actually a state person. So, and of course the other thing, in addition to identity and self-determination, was the whole issue of social justice with reform. And here you have many countries, whether reform against cultural norms and values, such as was the case in Guinea-Bissau and Zimbabwe, or socio-economic reforms with the development, such as was the case in the East African countries, being key. And that's why to Mwalimu, even in the Arusha Declaration, economic development was a key aspect of social justice. So then how come today, as African states, we are very much into reversing that in the name of development? Can there be development through dispossession of the nationals? So then the next bits of the paper really deal with citizenship as defined, but mainly it's an appreciation that it really, citizenship deals with aspects of belonging, being a part of, but also aspects of identity. And further on, it's really asking for the rights of the people within a geographical territory of the state, and how does the state relate with its people, and how can it guarantee social rights in addition to political rights and economic rights. We all have constitutions that spell out what citizens are supposed to get, and this gives people an impression that actually they belong and they have some entitlements, but we've seen many of those entitlements threatened, and with the risk of taking back or perceiving people more as natives more other than people who have a right to belong. So fast forward, when we talk about gender, contemporary debates around gender and identity have gone beyond racial identities to focus on both tribal and gender, whether male or female and non-binary, their age-based identities, whether people are young or they are elderly. And there are also contemporary debates around the role of women in development, but also beyond that, the current debates of gender have gone beyond just integrating women into development, into looking at the different axes of privilege and oppression, which actually structure people's experiences of maleness and femaleness. So this has drawn attention to other relationships of power, and including things like class, socioeconomic class, things like ethnicity, aspects of religion, age, location, and sexuality, to mention a few. An intersectional gender analysis is significant here, considering its origins to amplify the intersection of race and sex in the US, where Kimberly Crenshaw, a practicing lawyer, decided to focus on the plight of black females in the US judicial system. To her, the major point of disadvantage that these people were experiencing was the fact that they were both black and they were female. Beyond the US, in other parts of the world, this has been appropriated or adopted to make sense of the racial dichotomy beyond the West, between the West of the global North and global South, where the global North is distinguished as a site of development, and the global South, and Africa in particular, is distinguished as a site of natural resource extraction. And within African countries, these aspects of tribe, religion, regional differences of power continue to pit one group against another instead of exploring critical allyship strategies in the face of global capitalistic invasion. So beyond the traditional unequal gender relations emanating from negative cultural norms, African women have to contend with the exploitative nature of global capital, intruding into remote areas which were initially far detached from development. And with this, we've seen aspects of poor crop yields, environmental destruction, poisoned wells, landlessness, mineral extraction, land grabbing, expelling people off the land. And so what we say is that paying attention to how African women are located within the global economic enterprise and the strategies to solve this situation provides us with an opportunity to identify drivers of these experiences and potential solutions, and by extension, to identify key issues in identity and governance, which, if we paid attention to, could help us to achieve the Pan-African dream. So we've explained how the first case that I shared was really around denial of service by the contemporary state. The second case that I shared was really a threat of dispossession by an irrigation scheme that is going to introduce a kind of monocultural crop that people actually are not interested in. The two scenarios are important in illustrating how neoliberalism has shaped life in Africa individually and structurally. The consequences are felt at both individual level, either as dispossession or denial of care, or at structural level as violence, as expulsion, as poverty, and as inequality. All these levels reproduce marginality and disadvantage. Thank you. So they reproduce marginality and disadvantage, actually making these areas worse off so as to be eligible for neoliberal or capitalistic capture, as the state claims that they need. You know, there are many laws that have come up. We have to develop rural areas. If you have idle land, you have to be able to pay a tax on it, or else you're going to lose it. So there are all these strategies that have come up to try and bring the rural people into development, but really through dispossessing or taking away what they have. And to the locals, the concern is, so what happens about their livelihood? It's true the GDP and the GNP of the country will improve, but at the risk of dispossessing them and throwing them off. For them, it is coming from land ownership, however small it is, to actually becoming destitute in an economy where the state does not provide welfare. So then I say, while colonial dispossession really worked through direct occupation, contemporary development frameworks are perpetrating dispossession through natural resource extraction, and with African local elites and political elites taking away the citizens' rights, because they are now the major vehicle through which this is being done. So what is the way forward? And what would the insights from Mwalimu be? And I tried to imagine, if he lived today, what would his comments have been onto the Ugandan situation? And there are a few things, around 5, that I thought would be instrumental from the writings he made. One was the perception of development as social justice. Because I imagine if these people were better developed and were not seen as marginal areas for extraction, probably they would have some respect and they would have more services as citizens and not as people who are underdeveloped and are keeping, wasting productive land. The second is critical allyship between the masses and the African elites. African elites want to perceive themselves to be different, but indeed we are actually one and the same, and the previous speakers have analyzed that. We are both victims of global capital, and the earlier we collaborate, the better. And that means collaborating around tribe and around resolving conflicts. And if you read some of Mwalimu's sessions, he did mention about how we should actually not pay attention to tribe, but come together and build a national identity. The third really now focuses more on the national identity and the national consciousness, where the focus is really on ideological clarity and citizenship versus Africanization per se. And of course, when you read some of his works, when he was trying to address the burden of independence, those are some of the challenges they had to deal with. Were we going to have a black Tanzanian for black Tanzanians, or were other races that were already Tanzanians ready to have a role in it? In Uganda, we Africanized, we expelled whoever didn't have a black skin, but I think Tanzania and Kenya took a different lot. So he worked hard, and there are a lot of insights at building a Tanzanian national identity, which can actually come out handy in other parts of the continent. The other thing which is very important, especially coming from gender and women's studies, is his perception on the role of women in development. And here we always think that the quotation he made is very, very important, where women were encouraged to soar because they were created in God's image, and not to perceive themselves as something less. And he said, people have made you to think you're chickens. Women, you are created in the image of God, but people have made you to think you're chickens, and you yourselves think so. So he was really talking at the heart of empowerment there. But actually you are eagles. Straighten your wings and fly. Do not be content with chicken feed. With your own efforts and with the support of your friends, take yourselves out of the state of weakness in which you are today, so that you can enjoy freedom and justice in a peaceful world. And if you read actually our independence history, our nationalistic history, you find many countries that championed independence on Marxist line, on communist line, actually had a space for gender, as opposed to those that just looked at development. The last thing you would get from Mwalimu is the issue to do with ideology. Most of the times when we talk about neoliberalism, yes, it's okay, the last point. When we talk about neoliberalism, the focus is on its economic impacts. Rarely do we pay attention to its non-economic impacts. And that's the destruction of ideology, the destruction of the national spirit. All these things we are talking about as corruption are all found there. So we are made to believe that actually we are the same country, the policies are the same, and as countries we are all subjected to the same treatment. How come others come out better and others come out different? There's a role of location, there's a role of context, there's a role of history, and countries have to come up with ideologies that are going to deliver them. The last quotation before I leave here is what I'm going to conclude with, and it's a quotation that Mwalimu made, I think, when he was addressing Accra somewhere in 2017. And his point was, my generation led Africa to political freedom. The current generation of leaders and peoples of Africa must pick up the flickering torch of African freedom, refuel it with enthusiasm and determination, and carry it forward. Thank you, Professor Mkandala and the rest, for giving us an opportunity to review that. Hope we shall go back as better people. The journey continues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sarah, for your presentation. I now invite Mr. Omari to give his presentation. Karibu.
Thank you, Session Chair. Thank you, distinguished lecturer, Professor Katumanga. Thank you, Mwalimu Nyerere, Professor, for inviting me to give a talk today on conflict and reconciliation of competitive identities, Pan-Africanism, regionalism, and nationalism. My talk will mainly focus on the realm of ideas in particular, trying to soften the statecraft and security craft that have been presented by our esteemed distinguished lecturer, as well as our esteemed
past presenters. And this is about the triple identities in Africa and the aspirations of African unity, as has been clearly stated by the founding father of Organization for African Unity and the subsequent generations of African leaders. My presentation is summarized into 4 parts. The introduction, where I'll present my main argument, and then I'll proceed to try to contextualize my talk within the state of Africa today. And then I'll narrow down to discuss a bit about these competitive identities, the points of contradictions, divergency and convergency. And then I'll also proceed to look at the conflicting areas and overlaps. And finally, I'll conclude by offering some sort of a reconciliatory framework in order to reconcile these competitive identities. My main argument is that the regeneration of Africa, and by extension the revitalization of African unity, depends on the extent of our understanding of and reconciliation of these somehow competing identities, which sometimes clash within and across. And such contradictions have contributed to the balkanization of Mother Africa and the dwindling relevance and the dwindling aspirations of African unity by the African peoples here in the continent and in the Afro-diasporic world. But unpacking these identities, first I think I'll have to look at the state of Africa today. And this has been covered by the previous presenters, but I'll just go through them in order to give a context to my presentation. I think there are, when I look at Africa today, I see at least 4 things. First, in terms of security, you have persistent security challenges and protracted civil wars threatening national cohesion and regional security due to spillover effects, as Dr. Rasul said. These conflicts span regions, and they create what we call conflict formations. And then when I narrow down to look at the daily lives of the people, what I see in Africa is the exodus of African youth who legally and illegally immigrating to the West and the East, searching for livelihood opportunities due to poverty and declining standard of living across the continent. And this is a result of many problems, including climate change, unresponsive regimes, and others. Then, looking at the political institutions, what we see in Africa today, as it has been said earlier by the past presenters, including Professor Makulilo, is democratic backsliding. We are witnessing democratic weakening, and by democracy, in this sense, I mean substantive democracy, is that a democracy that not only focuses on the processes, but the substantive outcomes of these processes in terms of uplifting Africans from poverty. But we also have problems of unresponsive regimes or governance, and now we have regimes that rule by the law, but not rule of law. And then you have the problem of rampant corruption affecting peace and development prospects across the continent. But a positive note I see in Africa is I see Africa's agency in terms of reacting to the continent's marginalization in the world economy and in the international system, including confronting global economic forces. And this is very important for this discussion because it also points to the contradiction between these competing identities. From what I observed and find in this talk and in particular in my presentation, I see Africa's agency in 3-4 areas. One is you have the launching of African Continental Free Trade Area. The other is you have some African countries rejecting the economic partnership agreements which are negotiated at regional level with regional economic communities. And then I see some African states resorted to economic nationalism as a response to these international economic forces, as I have highlighted in my presentation. And then you have the problem of regionalism. You have regionalism that most of the integration process is more of a top-down rather than bottom-up. Most of these the 8 regional economic communities that we have under the African Economic Community. And this is also problematic. I'll come to it later. And so let me now narrow down to talk about competitive identities, these triple identities that shape the direction of continental unity. And my particular interest is on what constitutes the core of these identities. What are they competing for if the ultimate objective is to secure the African people in all aspects of social life? These identities, you have different basic components that inform these identities. First, you have the concept of nationalism, which constitutes the national identity. And in particularly in political theory, what we have is that defining nationalism, any attempt to define nationalism would inevitably exclude some part of this larger and complex phenomena. And as you all know that there are many forms of nationalism and to be found in political theory. And these varieties of nationalism include conservative nationalism, liberal nationalism, expansionist nationalism, anti-colonial, post-colonial nationalism. But the core elements that form the concept of nationalism you have 3 core elements. The first is that nationalism is the idea that nations are real, which points towards that whether they can be understood objectively or subjectively. And the second, you have that nationalism have practical implications in the way we relate with the other who are not part of this national identity. And then lastly, the last core element is nationalism is politically significant. When you synthesize these core elements, what you have 2 competing perspectives of nationalism. One is cultural nationalism, and the second is political nationalism. On the cultural part, or cultural perspective, nationalism is defined as a cultural communities, which they have a distinct national identity that is objectively understood in terms of physical or other characteristics, be it language, religion, or race. And this view is subscribed by Johann Herder, a German philosopher. And then you have a different contending perspective of nationalism, which sees nationalism as a political communities, in the sense as a national project, which is a national identity that is subjectively understood in terms of a common belief in membership, or will to belong and associate together. And this view is shared across by some few prominent Western philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Ernest Renan. But my interest today is on this second perspective of nationalism, which is political nationalism. And why is that? In modern Africa, the state existed before the nation, because the state that we have is the inherited colonial state. So it's a colonial inheritance, which reflects also colonial legacy. So the process of self-determination, or what we call African nationalism, was to constitute a nation within these territorial confinements, as our guest lecturer talked about it earlier. So African nationalism are the product of African nations are the product of African nationalism, and this is what I will focus when I'm trying to discuss about these competing identities. But again, you have another concept, which is Pan-Africanism, or another identity. Pan-Africanism builds on 4 elements. One is philosophical materialism. The second is ideological humanism. And the third is politically, the idea of a continental-wide state mechanism, or what we call a superstate, or the idea of supranationalism in particular, creating a supranational institution at the continental level. And then you have also what we call and then the fourth is economic, try to bring about economic transformation through industrialization, these mega projects that have been around. And the construction of African identity from a Pan-African sense builds on the idea of what we call political nationalism, in the sense that the conception of a nation as a political community where you have aspirations among people to associate. And then at the core also of nationalism is communitarian nationalism, because in traditional Africa, you have a community as the basic unit of analysis in particular, and that what I call this basic principle that I have defined, materialism, humanism, and values like collectivism, egalitarianism are part and parcel of the traditional African society. And then you have the concept also of the regionalism, which entails retreating to a regional level, creating the so-called regional economic units or regional security arrangements. And we have a multitude of them in Africa, at least 8. And what I have found is that the approach to regional integration in Africa has been mostly towards what we call intergovernmentalism, that the state is at the center, and the state is very reluctant to cede sovereignty to a supranational authority that we created at Addis Ababa after the institutional transformation from OAU to AU. And this is also a point of contradiction, because the aspiration of Pan-Africanism is supranational, create supranational institutions that a higher authority that stands above states. So this is how a communitarian society relates in Africa, which in the interest of time I won't talk about it. Let me go direct to conflicting areas. And my focus will be on this diagram. So what I discovered is that you found that there are points of contention and the points of also convergence between these two identities. Whereas you have Pan-Africanism and African socialism, they embody the same principles of humanism, that the primacy of human over capital, that treat humans as an end in their own right rather than treating them as a means to an end. And then you have the collectivism that we have been talking around about cooperation for mutual benefit, and that the focus on the we rather than the I. And then the concept of egalitarianism, the social justice. And this is common among many African nations, and as well the idea that the foundation of African socialism in general, and which also is the basic underlying idea in Pan-Africanism. And then you have the same also with regional economic communities, this convergence, humanism, collectivism, and egalitarianism. And I make reference to the treaty, to the EAC Treaty, the East African Community Treaty. Article 6 talks about the fundamental principle of the EAC, including ensuring social justice, good governance, rule of law, and this much relates to the idea of both humanism and egalitarianism. And then these three identities converge in different aspects. They both embody an integrationist spirit, in the sense that, but at different levels. Whereas Pan-Africanism focused at the continental level, regionalism at the regional and sub-regional level, which in this regard is about regional, And then African nationalism is at the national level, and perhaps even subnational level. And to integrate the Africans to overcome different perceived and actual threats from the internal and external pressure that are resulted by the legacy of colonialism. And then they also both embody the self-determination of African people in terms of safeguarding the independence and shielding these units from external economic forces, particularly international economic forces in the global economy. And then they embody also the principle of self-reliance, the Lagos Plan of Action, inward-looking policies. But later on, you had the Bag Report, which came with the outward-looking policies, tried to challenge the Lagos Plan of Action. And then you have the generation of the Washington Consensus, which tried to challenge the idea of self-reliance. And then regionalism and Pan-Africanism converge on the idea of political union, creating a political federation at regional level. I think this is the goal, the ultimate goal of the East African community, for instance. And Pan-Africanism embodies the same idea of political union, the superstate at the continental level. But they also both put a challenge on African nations, in the sense that external pressure on sovereignty, and that they have to cede more sovereignty in order to achieve this goal. So how do we reconcile this? Is Pan-Africanism a solution? And my question would be that are there reasons to believe that the age of national identity, that is nation states, in Africa may be drawing to a close? That is the question. And well, the nation state, this is the goal that the generation of nationalists have strived to achieve, increasingly beset by pressures, as I said earlier, both internal and external, and to overcome these mounting pressures and safeguard the self-determination of the African people in all spheres of social life, a continental political union is a way to go. And is a way to go as it can potentially reconcile the crisis of national identity. As we have crises within national identity, you have different conflicts from the Sahel to the Horn of Africa and the Central Africa. And this is a result also partly because of the ethnic mobilization and ethnic power struggles. In South Sudan, you have Dinka, you have the same in Ethiopia, the Tigray and the federal government, the Oromia and the Amhara or Afar. So these are some of the challenges that Pan-Africanism can be a solution to address. And this also revives the idea of Afro-optimism rather than Afro-pessimism, which produces a facile image about the realities of the continent. And for that matter, I see African Continental Free Trade Area a significant step towards the realization of viable African economic community, including addressing some of these contradictions. And that, as you can see, it has created the largest free trade area, belonging to, bringing together around 55 countries with a combined GDP of around 3.4 trillion. And this also is the integrated part of the realization of the African Union Agenda 2063. So thank you for listening. Thank you very much. Asanteni sana.
Thank you so much, Mr. Issa, for your presentation. As you listen to both presentations, they try to touch the issue of identities, but from different angles. Now it's time for us to ask questions and to give comments. We have 15 minutes for that, and we have only one round of about 5 questions or so. Yes? Ndio, karibu. Be brief when they say you address your question to each presenter.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman. But I would like to use my local language. May I allow? Asante. Swali langu litakuwa kidogo linajielekeza kwa Mr. Mohamed Bakari. Okay. Oh, okay. Omari. But here it's Mohamed. Okay. Sawa. Swali langu limejikita kwamba tunajaribu kutengeneza reconciliations ya kutatua conflict na vitu vingine. lakini njia zote tunazozifanya wanaokutana na kujadili ni viongozi wakubwa, yani wazazi wetu. Hata huko nyuma baadhi ya vitu tumeviferi kwa sababu leo hii tumekiuka maadili yetu, tumevunja miiko yetu kwa sababu kuna gap kati ya wazee na vijana. Na hata haya masuala ya mahusiano nayaona hivyo hivyo. Watu wanaopata nafasi ya kukutana kujadili masuala ya kutatua conflicts huko na mahusiano ni watu wazima, wazee, professors na watu gani, nyerevo kubwa za elimu. Lakini vijana wanazidi kutengenezwa na kitu kinachoitwa competition. Yaani mimi kijana wa Kitanzania nataka nishindane na kijana wa Kenya, sio nishirikiane naye. Kitu ambacho baadaye kitaleta conflict. Mpaka kuna siku kuna mtu alisema tunatamani tupate nini alisema friend match ya vita. Kwamba mpaka mtu anatamani tuwe na majaribio ya kupigana ni kwa sababu hawana cooperation. Sasa ni njia gani mnaiandaa ya kufanya na vijana waweze kuwa nakutana kwenye forum kama hizi, kujadili masuala ya mahusiano na kutatua migogoro, wakiwa vijana wakiwa nahusishwa, basi baadaye tunaweza tukaja kuwa na ulinzi mkubwa wa mahusiano. Lakini vijana wanapikwa, wanafichwa katika masomo na vyuo vyao, na wengine wako huko. Tunaandaliwa kwa kuwa na competition na sio cooperation. Sasa baadaye mtatengeneza mifumo mizuri, mtaandika notes nyingi, lakini kwenye ushirikishwaji vijana hawapo. Ni mikakati gani mnaiandaa kuwakutanisha vijana nao wawe kwenye hizi platform za kusolve masuala ya migogoro na mahusiano, kwa sababu ndio viongozi wa baadaye wakati wazee wamepumzika?
Asante sana.
Alafu ya mwisho tunaomba na pepa hizi zinazotolewa hapa tungeweza kupatiwa, tunashindwa kuzipitia.
Asante. Ndio Profesa Kaijage, karibu.
Thank you very much. I'd like to congratulate the presenters, both of whom have been excellent. I have a very short question to the lady from Uganda. I see that neoliberalism is the ultimate demon in your presentation in terms of all kinds of evils, including disempowerment, dispossession of the already oppressed and so forth. We have, I think in the past, tried alternatives to the neoliberal social order. I was wondering, and I don't think they have worked, and I was wondering what is your prescription of the ideal for your organizing society. Just an addendum to my question. You talked about ideological clarity. I think do you be a bit more forthcoming about that? What actually do you mean by ideological clarity? Which ideology? Thank you. Very short question, I hope.
Thank you, Professor Noe.
Thank you very much to Professor Sally and Omari. My question goes to Professor Sally. I heard you speak about dispossession, which is done mostly by local elites and international capital. And we are also talking about the past liberation struggles, because in the past there was active resistance by different groups, including women. Now my question is whether something has significantly changed that we don't really hear about active resistance. What has happened to local agency to the extent that we don't hear resistance actively, or maybe there's a difference of the way resistance is done now and in the past? For example, when you hear what Latin America is doing in terms of resisting to the forces that cause dispossession, it is very active compared to the region. Just to hear about your views, Prof.
Okay. Yes, karibu.
Thank you. My name is Mr. Valerius William Juni from the Department of Philosophy, University of Dar es Salaam. My question to Professor Sari. I have heard you giving examples of how some people were not willing to receive the kind of development. And you spoke that the development is people-centered. My concern is, do you think there is a need of going back into our communities to see if there are values central to engage when trying to distribute these resources into the people? Maybe, for instance, if I speak on my tribe where I'm coming from, I'm way higher by then. But if you go back into the higher community, you realize that they have some values which they need to, when the government is going to resend, maybe to reallocate the resources. Do you think there is a need of integrating the values which these people incorporate to see if they can be essential for them to receive the given resources? Simply to say, maybe in Swahili, to be clear, kuna nafasi gani ya kuangalia values walizonazo hawa watu katika jamii zao katika serikali inapoamua kuwapelekea misaada au vyanzo mbalimbali vya maendeleo kuliko kuwapelekea vile vitu ambavyo labda hawahitaji. Asante.
Okay. Thank you so much. 2 more questions? No? Okay, thank you so much. Now I invite our presenters to respond to the question. Mr. Omari, karibu.
Many thanks for these good questions. And from what I see here, that I have only one question directed to me. And this is from my friend there. And he's asking about the involvement and participation of youth in conflict prevention, conflict resolution, in the peace process in general. And that youth have been for a long time neglected and excluded from these processes. And, but recent developments have shown that youth, from a gender perspective also, that youth, women and children have been part of these ongoing conflicts, including violent extremism. And that to comprehensively respond to these security challenges, we need an all-encompassing and all-inclusive process. And I think this is what even the global goals, sustainable development goals, the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, tries to address by creating systems that are more inclusive, institutions that are more inclusive in order to give youth a platform and a forum for participation and to contribute to national development, including in areas of peace and development. So I think this is done by several institutions even here in Tanzania, including Mwalimu Nyerere Foundation, Uongozi Institute, and many other institutions at the local level. Even we have this, what we call community-based, the concept of community-based policing, where youth are key participants and actors in trying to secure local security, especially in areas that are seriously disturbed by insecurity. So I think youth have been increasingly involved in these processes, especially whether in conflict prevention, conflict resolution, or even in this conflict reconciliation in particular, the peacemaking process. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairperson. I have a few questions, and the first question, if I can do this quickly, was neoliberalism being the ultimate of the core of everything, and whether there are alternatives in the reorganization of society. Yes, I did actually anchor it in neoliberalism, and I thought this was important, especially when we were speaking about African citizenship. Because there was, and if I can tie this together with ideology, there was a reason why Africans struggled for independence. And this independence was a particular form of struggle for national determination. They were, and you know, identities are constructed all the time, so they are always constructed and deconstructed and negotiated. And at that time, they were rallied together because the racial dichotomy did not matter, so they needed to get together. And they did struggle and win that war of liberation. But we also know, for the reasons many people have said before us today, of what happened to the African state. And when we suffered the economic shocks, we suffered and went neoliberal the way we went. My concern with that is it let loose many other things, particularly the requirement of the state to abdicate from providing for the people in the name of markets, in the name of capitalism, in the name of choice, and all those things that ran around in the 90s and 80s. And where actually the state was only good to guarantee a good environment and leaving everything to private capital. When actually the people had been organized by the state, and people looked to the state for guaranteeing certain things, which actually the market cannot guarantee. So what we are seeing today is, one, if you have a situation where in the past rural lands were developed by extension services, and they were indeed productive. That's why when you go to many of these areas, you'll find railway lines reaching there. Today, the railway lines or the sleepers are idle because there's nothing to come from those areas. Why? Because agriculture died, okay? And when it died, okay, peasant agriculture, it was peasant agriculture, but it did produce. So now the years of disinvestment in people are being used to construct peasants as people who are not productive, as people who are sitting on land that they are wasting durable land. And in whose interest is this land being captured? It's being captured for commercial farmers, and they could be local or international. It's being captured for natural resources and all the carbon credits, what today is being talked about in terms of climate colonialism, is being captured for minerals. And we are not saying this is necessarily a very bad thing, but what are the rights of the people within that? So I talk about neoliberalism because it enables those kinds of things. And I talk about dispossessions because it reorganizes the relationships around how people relate with what they initially thought was theirs under the constitutional provision of citizenship. And then, of course, the past had active resistance to dispossession, and why don't we see active resistance today? Again, this is where I go back to the non-monetary cost of neoliberalism, in that the fragmentation of people, leaving people to their own devices, and in our parts of the world, you see, I mean, because, I don't know whether because Uganda has had a very long period of misrule, people even do not look to the state for anything. So it's like everyone is on their own and God is for us all. So even when people face challenges like lack of access to services and basic services, in spite of them paying a tax, they will not actually see the state as a problem. They will see themselves as not being creative and innovative enough. And of course, with the growth of evangelical churches, there's a lot of the belief system also whereby the state gets celebrated even when it's the biggest abuser. So you will actually not see active resistance. In the last election, you did have a younger group, people who actually classified themselves as people from the ghetto who had been, they were actually mobilized as people who had been shortchanged by the state. The brutality with which the state reacted to Bobi Wine and his campaign, it will take long for anyone to ever resist. I mean, younger people were targeted just for the sake that they were young and that they were staying in depressed areas in the city. So Uganda historically has not had a history of armed resistance because of the way we have been ruled historically. And also that means people don't blame the state even for what they don't have. People just know that, well, you pray to God, you do your best, you become innovative, and then you give up, okay? And why am I raising these things here? It's because Mwalimu Julius Nyerere gave people hope. And we are in a Mwalimu Julius Nyerere Intellectual Festival where some of these things should be reflected on. Why was there a struggle for independence? Okay, and then about the values, and I would want to handle the issue of values in society together with the issue of ideology. I know if we went to political science like we talked about the West, and we talked about the East, and we talked about communism, and we talked about capitalism and everything else. But of recent, the more I've grown, the more I've realized that philosophy is not only resident in the West, okay? Ideology is not only resident in the West. Our societies were organized. There was knowledge, which unfortunately maybe it was never documented, or it was written about and it's not available to us. And I think in this era of decolonization, this should invite us to look at what works for us. So I don't want to sit here and claim that I have the right ideology for Tanzania or for Uganda, but to say what works in a particular community in a particular time. What is important is for the state not to abdicate its responsibility. And with that, work together with either what are local values or what are practical values in a setting, as long as people are not shortchanged. That is better than the state abdicating and saying, you know, for us, we only are focusing on security and providing a conducive environment. We've released development to the private sector. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Can we give a hand of applause to our presenters and to all of us for your patience and the contribution. Thank you so much. I think we have come to an end of our panel. Okay, thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause for our... Thank you very much. We've come to an end to admittedly a long day, but we are very grateful. We thank you all for staying to the end. Tomorrow we'll start at 9. Now, unlike today, breakfast will be served at 11. So after the first session. So we'll start at 9 until 11. We'll have the refreshments at 11, and then we'll continue with the other session. So please, I wish you a good rest this evening, ready for tomorrow. Asante sana. Karibu tena.